Today's story is not whether you believe in ghosts or not. Today's story is a true story about someone that actually dies after they claim they had seen a ghost. I need you guys to leave it in the comments section. What's your take on this story? On the afternoon of Sunday, February 25th, 1855, 48-year-old Hannah Relson and her husband and a group of friends would walk quickly down a road in Sheffield, England. Hannah and her small group walked very fast to a building. They were walking silently and very intense because they were very scared of what was going to happen as soon as they reached that building. They were being followed by a large crowd, but the large crowd behind them had no intention of going inside that building. As Hannah walked, she was so annoyed by the large crowd following her. But what could you do? Ever had a nosy friend or a nosy neighbor? You can't do anything to nosy people. They must know your business. The good thing about me is I always mind my own business, and I advise that to you guys. Mind your own business, folks. Anyway, Hannah was thinking to herself, how did I get into this mess? Sheffield, England was an industrial city and had many metal factories, and Hannah and her husband worked in one of those metal factories and lived in one of those tenement apartments. Hannah and her husband already had a hard-knock life, but it recently got even harder when their oldest son died in a coal mining accident. This drove Hannah into depression. She would go work hard and just return home and just pray to God and try to communicate with her dead son. Her husband did the same, but eventually he started to move on. But he would see Hannah still not moving on and still depressed. So he would tell her, honey bun, you should go to church and socialize with people. It would really help you. And she followed her husband's advice. The church group really helped Hannah, but ironically, it would put Hannah in a whole new problem. That was the group following Hannah and her husband, speed walking to their home, to that building. That was the group behind them. In Hannah's speed walking group were her husband, the Fabel family, Mr. and Mrs. Fabel, and Fabel's sister. And Hannah also had her close friend from church, Harriet Ward, with them. They were speed walking to their home, to the building. They were all heading to the tenement apartment on Campbell Lane, where Harriet Ward and the Fabel family all lived together. Both groups came from the same place, the church, and that day they had had a heated argument for 2 hours about what were they going to do about the thing in Harriet Ward and the Fabel family basement. Time out. Today's everyone's lucky day because I'm going to give everyone that's watching this video something for 100% free. I'm going to give you guys a free prayer. God bless anyone that hits that like button under this video. Alright, time back in. Let's go back. Some parishioners said Harriet and the Fabels were just making up stories, and the other parishioners believed them and said Harriet and the Fabels had something very dangerous in their basement, and that building needs to be blocked off or completely demolished. And when Harriet and the Fabels heard that, they would get up and just walk out of church, and Hannah and her husband also followed them. The Fabels and Harriet didn't know what to do, but they sped walked to their building. They just had to get there and figure out what to do. They didn't want that building to be demolished or anything. Hannah and her friends reached the apartment building. They entered and closed the door. But now, what are they going to do? They didn't know. But one of them said, "We gotta take care of what's in the basement. Because if we don't, the people outside will." So Hannah would walk up to this big window and see a huge crowd looking into a smaller window that looked down into the basement. Hannah would walk back to the group and say, "Guys, what are we gonna do?" Mr. Fabel would say, "Whatever we're gonna do, we gotta do it quickly because it's not gonna be daylight for long, and none of us wanna go in the basement in the dark, if you know what I mean." He would point at Hannah's husband and say, "You coming down with me?" Hannah's husband didn't really want to go into the basement, but a man has to do what a man has to do. So he said, "Amen, let's go." So the men entered the basement, and for the next 2 hours, all you heard was banging sounds as the men destroyed the concrete in the basement. But every time they would destroy it, all they found was dirt. But the group outside looking into the basement would get larger and larger and larger. Hannah was getting nervous watching the crowd growing outside the window, but not as nervous as knowing that the sun will set soon and her husband is still in the basement. And finally, when the sun did set, she would run by the basement door and yell, "Guys, drop what you're doing and come on up." And the guys dropped what they're doing and would listen to her and go up. So they all said, "Let's just sit down and have dinner. And eventually the crowd will leave once it's dark enough and they can't see in the window." So they sat down and had dinner, but the crowd didn't leave. It was growing and growing and growing. At 12 midnight, Mrs. Fabel was starting to get worried that someone might break into her basement window and enter her house and harm her or rob her. So she would go to a big window and pull down the curtain and go to her sister and say, "Here, go downstairs to the basement and cover the basement window." And her sister would look at her. "What? Are you crazy? You want me to go in the basement at midnight by myself to cover the window?" So Hannah would say, "Give me that," and take the curtain and go into the basement by herself. Everyone looked at from above to see what was going to happen to Hannah. Hannah hung up the curtain and yelled upstairs, "Guys, I did it, and I'm on my way back up." So they all waited for Hannah, but then it just went silent. They were all wondering what happened to Hannah. And all of a sudden, Hannah screams out, and then silent again. Her husband would run downstairs and he would see Hannah passed out. He would pick her up and bring her upstairs, and he knows she's still breathing, so he would shake her. "Get up, Hannah! Get up, Hannah!" Harriet ran and got a wet towel and kneeled down next to Hannah and put the wet towel on Hannah's forehead. And then Harriet would look down into the basement, and all of a sudden, and she too would faint. The big story about the basement started a few weeks earlier, in early February, when Harriet and the Fabel family started hearing these weird noises in the basement. At first they didn't take them seriously, but the noise were getting louder and louder. So they just stopped going to the basement. Sometimes they would go to the basement during the day, real quick, but never at night. On February 24th, just one day before everything happened, Harriet swore she saw a ghost in the basement. She said she saw a lady with a white gown just pointing to a certain spot on the ground. And that night when Harriet went to bed, she had a dream of the same woman, and the woman would tell her, "I was murdered, and my jewelry's buried right there." Harriet would share her ghost story at church on February 25th, and that was actually the church group following Harriet and the Fabels to their home to see if they were going to confront the ghost. Harriet and Hannah would both wake up after passing out, and each one would tell us their story, what made them pass out. Hannah would say after she was done hanging up the curtain and she turned around to come back upstairs, she would see the ghost, a woman in a white gown. Between her and the stairs, Hannah would scream, "Ah!" and the woman would go right through her. And as soon as she went through her, she would faint. Harriet would say as she was putting the wet towel on Hannah's forehead, she looked into the basement and the woman in the white gown was coming up the stairs. She would walk up to her and open her mouth real wide and then just unbutton her gown, and the gown would fall to the ground and she was covered in cuts all over her body, and Harriet would just faint. When Harriet and Hannah came through and woke up, the police were at the scene and the police dispersed the crowd, so Hannah and her husband were able to go home. 12 hours later, Hannah would die, and the coroner would examine her body, but couldn't find any reason why she would die. So on her death certificate, it just says, "Death from fright." This is the only case in recorded history that someone died from being scared. Following Hannah's death, Harriet and the Fabels and many people in that building would move out that building because no one wanted to be near that building or near that basement. I'm Ahmed Bassioni, and I wanted to thank you guys for watching today's video. God bless you. I owe you guys one. Please like, share, and subscribe. I'm out of this joint.